Now, my next pleasure while I'm up here is to introduce our keynote speaker, Kathy Jacobs. Kathy is the Director of the Centre for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions at the University of Arizona. She directed the third National Climate Assessment in the United States and served in the Barack Obama administration, the White House. She's been very keen on pointing out exactly which administration she served under, I would note. She has been lead advisor to the President's Science Advisor on water policy and climate adaptation. She also has more than 2 decades of experience as a water manager in Arizona and builds large-scale collaborative projects between academia and decision makers. Her research interests include water policy, connecting science and decision-making, stakeholder engagement, and the use of climate information for water management applications. Kathy is also a member of our independent science panel. So that science panel comes to New Zealand for our conferences to understand what the Deep South Challenge is doing and to help us build better science and to make sure that the science we're doing in New Zealand is of international standard. And we're extremely pleased that Kathy accepted our invitation to join our independent science panel last year. And so, Kathy, I invite you up onto the stage and I look forward to what you have to tell us today.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you so much to the entire Deep South operation. You are an impressive group of people, and this whole operation is really humbling. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and thrilled to hear Councillor Hulst talk in the way she does, because if all of our local government officials spoke that way, we wouldn't have the problems that we have at the moment. I also want to acknowledge the original owners of the land. That's how we refer to it in the United States. It is nowhere near as sophisticated as the way you respect the Maori here, and I need to take a few lessons home with me. But anyway, what I'm here to do today is to talk a little bit about managing risk and connecting science and decision making. I think that's sort of the next step in what you're all working on. I am incredibly impressed by what's been accomplished by the Deep South Initiative. There's a lot of good work that's going on. I think the next step really is moving into the action space, and there's lots of potential. So I'm hoping that you'll take away this opportunities message. I'm going to travel through a few barriers messages before we get to the opportunities. I'm just warning you that that's the direction of the flow. But I'm going to start by talking about why risk management is important. And I'm guessing this isn't big news to any of you, but I think the way it's articulated might be a little different. So I worked, as was mentioned, in the White House. My boss was somebody named John Holdren. He said all the time, we have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. Really, the choice is what proportion of those things are we going to engage in. The more mitigation we do in managing of emissions, the less adaptation will be required and the less suffering there will be. So essentially what the message is here is that action is going to happen. It's either proactive and you actually take charge of your future, or it's reactive and you respond to a lot of extreme events and emergencies. Obviously, proactive ends up being a little less expensive and causing way less suffering. So there are steps forward that really can be taken. And what I am hearing among all of you is a real desire and a real capacity to move forward into the adaptation space and focusing on outcomes and actions as opposed to focusing only on the science, because actually you seem to be in a place where it's literally a threshold and you can get there from here quite easily. So I hope that that's the message that you take from my presentation today. So I want to talk a little bit about the issue of managing risk. I think a lot of people believe that if you just identify the risks, some kind of set of solutions is going to automatically cascade out of that. That's not actually how it works. First of all, institutions are either in the way or helpful, but institutions have to be recognized, whether they're government institutions or private sector institutions. perceptions of risk are actually more important than actual risk because it's your perceptions that cause you to behave differently. So really this issue of how people perceive risk is critical to making the path forward. And then, of course, and I don't actually need to tell any of you this because you clearly already understand it, but there are many ways of learning and knowing and engaging, and they all have to be respected and be part of a solution. So when I talk about systems-based solutions, I'm thinking about social systems-based solutions and multiple knowledges, not just scientific knowledge. But then possibly most important is the decision context. What is the space that decision makers have to make decisions? Are they highly constrained, or can they really move forward and do the right thing without any new laws or new funding or, convincing their boss that that is actually what needs to happen? So this issue of the decision context is often overlooked by scientists because they don't recognize all of those constraints that are really unspoken often. So my whole life is essentially living in this bridging the gap space. How do you deal with politics versus reality? How do you deal with the connections between science and decision making? It is actually a big gap between knowing and doing, and we all need to figure out together how to cross that bridge. And from my perspective, a lot of that has to do with understanding what science can do for us and what it can't. Both physical science and social science have to be part of this solution, but it's not like you can just lob a bunch of science into a problem and poof, there is an outcome. That is not how things work in the real world, at least not in the United States. It's quite possible it's different here, but honestly, I don't think it is going to be that different. So one of the things that I think is very important is acknowledging legitimate differences in perspective and training when you're in this space between science and decision making. Obviously, scientists come into problems with a different perspective than stakeholders or social scientists or decision makers. In this cartoon, these people are all looking at the same thing. It looks like a 3 to one of them, an M to another, an E to a third, and a W to the fourth. They are all looking at the same thing, and they are seeing something different. And that is so common. We see it every time we're engaged in a public strategy. There are communications issues, there are language issues, there are all kinds of perception and training issues that affect how people frame the problem in the first place. And so this issue of framing problems in a way that actually can lead to outcomes is absolutely critical. And failure to recognize this difference in perspective really is a problem. And then this issue of managing risk. I think if you're a scientist, it's very easy to fall into a trap, which is that you have to understand both the likelihood and the consequence of future events before you can manage risk. In reality, you can manage risk without perfect knowledge, and I hope that I convince all of you of that because I've been working in this imperfect world for a long time and trying to convince people that really we need to move forward regardless of whether we've got every I dotted and every T crossed. But it is helpful to understand the intensity and duration of future climate drivers, and perhaps even more importantly, to understand the underlying sources of vulnerability, including social and institutional and physical vulnerability. If you fail to understand that, then managing climate change actually is very difficult. But if you incorporate these underlying vulnerabilities into the strategy for the solution, climate change sort of becomes an opportunity to think about all of these things as systems, looking at solutions to multiple problems at the same time. So it really is helpful to think of it perhaps that climate change is exacerbating risk as opposed to it's actually causing all of the risk. So the other part of managing risk is who makes decisions. And the answer is we all make decisions. Every single day we manage risk, whether it's deciding to cross the street or take an umbrella or whatever. But then there are so many other actors that are, agencies and cities and towns and energy sector executives and so forth. So we can't actually design a risk management strategy that's unique to every one of these decision makers. We have to acknowledge there's a wide array of people making decisions at different scales and being concerned about different time frames into the future. And so this sort of underlying set of challenges can really become daunting if you don't just choose to move past it, because you could just say, this is impossible. There's way too many people involved. There's too many kinds of risk. It's all connected and cascading. I'm going to just give it up. But don't do that, because there really are lots of paths forward. So another, by the way, I'm now in the depressing part of my talk, so just live with me for a while. But one big issue we've seen with decision makers is this issue of wanting to know exactly what they have to adapt to. They want to know in 2050, what is the sea level rise going to be? They want to know in 2070, what degree of variability there's going to be in precipitation in the summer. You know, those are not answerable questions at this point. We know the direction of change in almost all cases, which is incredibly helpful. But most decision makers want to know about a single future. That is a huge trap. There needs to be preparation for multiple futures. That's why scenario planning is necessary. We don't know, we know a lot about the climate system, actually. What we don't know about is people. We don't know whether we're going to manage our emissions, and that is absolutely one of the most controlling factors in what the future looks like. So if we don't even know that, we certainly can't say there's going to be 1 meter of sea level rise by X time or 2 meters by Y time. And so we have to be really careful about that and think about multiple futures. Also, for many, and perhaps not the people you deal with, but certainly the people I have been dealing with, this idea of non-stationarity in the system is a new paradigm. Most engineers were taught that, you know, the hydrologic cycle goes like this, and not that the hydrologic cycle goes like this with a lot of variability over it. So this whole idea of non-stationarity in the system is hard for people who have been taught that this is how it is, and the past will be like the present and the future. And then these interactions between trends and extreme events are really hard. They're hard communication problems because obviously you have extremely cold winters at the same time that you have global temperatures increasing. So what's happening locally, what's happening globally, what's happening at multiple scales needs to be explained to people, and that's hard as well. And then these linkages and cascading effects. The talk I gave yesterday, I really mentioned the fact that the systems are what we need to deal with, and we're talking about ecological systems and human systems and climate systems, and they are all linked at almost every stage. Everybody loves it to be linear, and it is not linear. There's all kinds of potential for failures associated with the intersections of systems, whether it's communication systems, transportation systems, healthcare systems, et cetera. And if we don't think about those linkages between systems, we are not going to manage risk, period. That's just the beginning and the end from my perspective. But more about barriers. So connecting science and decision-making requires people to think in a very interdisciplinary way. Many people are not taught that way, and so sort of opening your mind to that is critical, and clearly a lot of you are doing that at this very moment. But understanding the institutional and legal boundaries and what needs to change in order to allow for a more resilient future. There are all kinds of people and organizations that are invested in the status quo. There couldn't be any more obvious example of that than the behavior of people in the United States relative to coal and politics right now. But it's about people's existing financial investments and emotional investments lots of times. Just change itself is frightening. But then the value of information. Lots of people don't actually know how to use the science that's produced. And the scientists may have to help people understand how it's valuable in a decision context. Many times, lots of new information can't make the kind of difference that you would hope it would. And so this idea of value of information and consequences of acting versus the consequences of not acting, that's a very big problem when you're making an investment in an uncertain future? How do you convince people to make these investments today in this generation that are going to protect people further into the future? And then there are actually limitations to science. I'm not sure everybody in the room will acknowledge this fact, but making sure that people have the best information that is available, but it's also well articulated what the limitations of that information is, so that people really know how to use it, as opposed to, you're a scientist and you're smart and you know this stuff and so you're right. More, you're the scientist and you're smart and you know this stuff, but it may or may not be relevant to this particular decision context. So it's already been mentioned that we've entered into a post-fact world to some degree. We in the United States are enduring this at the moment. It is absolutely frightening, and this has to be changed. We have a president, and it was just pointed out to me yesterday, the fact checkers at the Washington Post have identified more than 10,000 times that our president has not told the truth in the last 2 years. So whether he knows he's not telling the truth in every one of those cases, who knows? But this assault on facts and science is incredibly frightening if we're trying to manage risk. Facts matter, period. And so we have to get ourselves into a place where people can't be elected who behave this way, because it's really too frightening for us and future generations. So just a few more challenges. Obviously, trying to understand when to act as opposed to when to wait is a critical problem. There's a lot of ways to phase adaptation actions in, and there's a lot of science in that. There are lots of long-term, multi-generational issues here, and so the trade-offs of the short-term versus the long-term is really critical. We have, fortunately, made huge progress in terms of attributing extreme events to climate change recently. This is very helpful in terms of being able to understand the economics of climate change and the economics of making investments in managing for the future. So this is a place where I think there's been major progress, but it's still hard to explain to the public the context in which, how you know that a certain event was affected by climate change, not caused, but affected. I mean, climate change is only one of the causes in almost all cases. And so across the board, there's a need for better coordination. We've worked on that in the United States in a very unsuccessful way. I don't believe that the national government is working especially well with local governments. The good news is that local governments are really standing up and taking charge in many cases, but without some kind of national orchestration, there's a lot of redundancy and a huge amount of wasted resources. And so I feel really strongly that we need that kind of national coordination, and I'm guessing you do too. And then finally, just the ability to do science translation in specific science contexts and decision contexts is largely missing. In other words, this middle, I call it the middleware, or the middle ground between the scientists and the decision making. We need to build that space, and that's what most of the rest of my talk is about. So there are a lot of ways to overcome all those things. I hope you're still with me and I haven't depressed you to the point where you're turned off, because that is an official way to respond. But so long-term relationships between scientists and decision makers have been shown to result in a much more trusted relationship, and so it is really helpful. And so gatherings like this get to know somebody who isn't what you are, and build those relationships and stay in touch. Understanding the implications and the limitations of co-production of knowledge. This is a term that is extremely popular in the United States. This idea of learning together between scientists and stakeholders is actually a valid and completely useful approach. However, it's very transactional, and there are limitations that need to be acknowledged. There is really a need to invest in this idea of interdisciplinary knowledge in the real-world context, which is problem-focused, but maybe scalable, so that you're not solving every problem individually. You're taking those lessons from one particular location and spreading it to multiple locations, or from one scale and actually expanding to other scales. And then there's capacity building. How do we learn to speak each other's language? How do we help people who are stakeholders be engaged in processes that are highly political or require a lot of institutional knowledge? So there's lots of sort of steps in the path ahead, but these are all so doable. In my world, a lot of what I do is try to simplify science for people who are trying to make decisions. Now, these are not the things I necessarily would say to you, because I actually don't know very much about New Zealand. But in the Southwest, what I say to people is, you might not know how much hotter it's going to be, but we're absolutely certain it will be hotter, period. And because it will be hotter, even if there is an increase in precipitation, it's highly probable that there will be a reduction in stream flow, because the change in temperature has such a giant impact on evapotranspiration and on soil moisture and so forth. So that temperature driver is critical to, at least to us. Evapotranspiration will increase because, in fact, that's what physics says. It will be drier on average in terms of precipitation, but possibly more intense rainstorms. And the likelihood of cascading effects is very high. So understanding how the systems are connected, how heat waves are connected to failures in the grid system, how that can actually result in forest fires, how that can result in changes in air quality and big demands on the healthcare system, how that can result in sedimentation of reservoirs and loss of capacity. All of those are system linkages that exist today and have just been observed in California in the last year. So the path forward does involve lots of investments in physical science, and I am not here to tell you that that is not the case. Absolutely it's the case. Physical science needs to continue to make the kinds of contributions it has been. There are a number of specific ways that have been identified in every sector, sort of linking physical science to specific questions. So I'd really strongly encourage that kind of a conversation where you really are trying to understand which physical science questions could be most usefully answered from the perspective of decisions. But there's also a whole arena of social science questions that are actually science, and data-based, but have a great deal to do with whether or not we can make better decisions. So issues like, there he is, okay. Understanding the costs and benefits of action versus inaction, and I think maybe most importantly, who are the winners and the losers associated with any given issue, because there will be winners and losers. You make an investment in adaptation, it doesn't necessarily benefit everybody the same way, and not everyone pays the same. And so there are winners and losers of every decision, and so those things need to be thought about. There's a potential for adverse consequences or maladaptation, which comes back to understanding these systems perspective. Really, it's important to think all the way through the consequences of individual decisions. But again, very doable. There's a need to monitor for the effectiveness of adaptation actions. And if you don't set up a baseline, how are you going to know whether or not you're making any progress? And when the baseline happens in the context of a lot of variability, how do you deal with that? Well, that's a social science question. Deciding when to move from low regrets options to retreat or much more impactful options. How do you decide that? Well, social science can help with that. And of course, this broad issue of environmental justice and equity issues that are rising in priority, I think, across the world, and are strongly linked with climate change and have to be addressed. And yet we don't have most of the data that are required to do this kind of thing. So I think empowering social scientists and helping them get data, especially in real-world decision-making contexts, not theoretical contexts, but the same kind of real-world stuff we're talking about here. So I'm going to jump into some of my own experience and lessons learned in doing this boundary-spanning work. I'm not sure everybody sort of uses that language of boundary spanning, but the way I see it is trying to be not sort of in one camp or the other camp, but actually operating between communities, whether it's scientific communities or stakeholder communities or whatever, and being a facilitator of the flow of information across that boundary. That's a space where I think there's a huge amount of opportunity here. I have 4 different examples that I'm going to jump through here, and I'm hoping that some of them might actually give you some ideas of things that you might be able to do. So the first is something called the Arizona Water Institute, which, by the way, no longer exists. But it is not always easy to succeed in boundary management organizations. But it was created by a governor of Arizona who subsequently left the state and joined the Obama administration. And the minute she left, the legislature eliminated it, so it's not without risk. But we brought all 3 of Arizona's state universities together into a system focused on solving real-world problems, provided small amounts of funding for seed money, required the universities to work together to solve problems with the stakeholders or the communities whose problems they were trying to solve. We were managing faculty members and managing people in state agencies, trying to focus the issues on the ones that were most important for managing risk. And it was a really amazing experience, and we were making a whole lot of progress before it was eliminated. In 3 years, we completed 30 projects. And it was complicated institutionally because we were shared between these 3 universities and 3 state agencies. So I had 6 bosses, which is not ideal in most cases. But it was a very interesting way of taking advantage of publicly funded university faculty and their students and building an institutional structure that helps answer questions in a managed context. So it's not just giving money to scientists and saying, have a nice day, bring us back the facts. It was the opposite. We actually messed with their proposals, and we managed their outcomes, and we made sure the stakeholders were happy with what it was that was happening. So really managing was the lessons here. What I learned about that, which was something that might already have been easily known, is that managing the expectations of all the parties was maybe the most important thing. Like, don't oversell what you can do. It's actually better to undersell and overperform than to raise expectations too high. But this idea of managing the boundary, having somebody in charge of those relationships, is a really good idea, and it's not that hard to do if you have people who can speak both science language and stakeholder language and help people communicate. So the second one was actually a research project that I took on early in my very late academic career. And that really was an international comparison of 4 watershed management systems and looking at what kinds of stakeholder engagement processes were successful in these 4 different basins in Thailand, Brazil, Arizona, and Mexico. And some of these conclusions are actually very hard for people to accept. So bear with me as I explain this. Obviously, it's critical to engage stakeholders. It's impossible to solve problems without engaging stakeholders. That being said, simply engaging them does not ensure sustainable outcomes, period. Having them in the room is not enough. Even if they've talked a lot, it may not be enough. There needs to be a lot more to this kind of conversation than just having them in the room or having them participate. It is not a guarantee of success. Second, and related, is that there are lots of transaction costs associated with engaging with stakeholders. It's very much about relationships. And in many cases, things don't go well. Researchers can be unpleasantly surprised by what happens in these situations and get burned and then not ever want to do that again. That is not a good outcome. But it is important to understand that that can happen and to manage the expectations of everyone who's involved to try to avoid that. One way to do that is to make sure that the people are meeting as equals in this conversation which is almost never the case. I mean, the scientists are talking about really fancy stuff with big words, and stakeholders may or may not even know what they're talking about, and there can be quite a bit of difficulty in these conversations. It also can lead to contested knowledge, especially if there are multiple knowledge systems involved. And so understanding that when you open that box, you have to own what's in the box, which is, it could take some time to get people to a place where they're having real conversations and getting to better outcomes. And so this idea of investment in the stakeholder engagement process, not just so that they show up at a meeting, but so when they show up at the meeting, they're comfortable and they speak and they engage and they walk out feeling like they have contributed to the conversation. And in all of that, it takes resources, and time is probably the most important one. And that isn't always something that's planned as part of a particular project. In other words, you may not know that when you open the box, what's going to jump out of it. And so at least leaving some leeway for more engagement and more strategic work once you have done that is really important. So there are lots of learnings associated with stakeholder engagement when the intent is to solve real-world problems. Obviously, there is stakeholder engagement that is intended mostly for window dressing. I am guessing that is not the kind that you're all very interested in. But the kind where you're really trying to solve problems, you just need to understand these possible futures. So the third has to do with running the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which it was mentioned I had the privilege of doing. That was a giant effort, and it was almost all about process. How do you have inclusive processes? How do you engage with people in ways that lead to sustained relationships? How do you empower citizens to be part of something that is a federal government project? Very difficult. So we actually tried to change the expectations about what the National Climate Assessment could do for the United States. We tried to make it into more of an engagement strategy, to bring people who are decision makers in as equals with scientists to talk about what it is that they knew from their on-the-ground experience and share their knowledge with the scientists and have a lot of bantering back and forth. Because really, scientists aren't that good at understanding risk in particular communities if they don't live there. So this whole idea of an inclusive, broad-based strategy for doing the National Climate Assessment was focused on building capacity across the country over the long term to actually manage risk. And as you can see, there's now been a series of national climate assessments. I was associated with the 2014 one. There was one that came out of the Trump administration at the end of this last year, which had not been messed with, which was great, but it's not clear that that will happen again. But in the meantime, my colleagues and I have concluded that even in the Obama administration, we did not have the kind of engagement with citizens that was necessary to really help manage risk. It was fundamentally a federally driven process. It was not focused explicitly on decision-making, and so we decided that we needed to build a citizen-based version of the National Climate Assessment. The report on this has just come out in the last month. I'd strongly recommend that you take a look at it. It can be found at www.climateassessment.org. It's really about how do we structure an ongoing assessment process that is fundamentally linked to making decisions, not just linked to summarizing the state of knowledge, but linked to making decisions. And so this has been an evolution of effort. We ultimately concluded that it just cannot be done entirely within the federal government and that citizens need to be part of the process. And part of what we are doing, and this looks very complicated and I'm not trying to scare you, is just link existing networks to processes so that you don't have to build all the capacity, you just link to existing networks of capacity and have that contribute to this decision support system as opposed to it being everybody for themselves. So a lot of lessons associated with my work with the National Climate Assessment. One of them is the power of networks. We actually had, by the end, 200 different organizations that were part of something called the National Climate Assessment Network. They helped us with everything from gathering data to our communication strategies. They represented professional societies and corporations and academics and so forth, all interested in solving this same problem. And we weren't paying for any of their work, and we didn't pay for any of the authors to participate in the National Climate Assessment. The only thing that was paid for was the coordination and editing and graphics. So it's not like these things have to be giant expenses. But the importance of process was a big part of the learning here. If the process is enduring and respected, the product isn't as important because honestly, it can be an ongoing effort. You can improve it the next time. And a point that I think is really important given where you all are, which is on the brink, I think, of a massive change in how you do business if you're going to both be having a carbon management strategy about to happen and you're on the brink of designing your national climate assessment. All of this can be designed so that it's supporting adaptation and action and strategic as opposed to just writing a report. So I think you are right on the brink of something incredibly exciting that really the Deep South strategy has strongly contributed to. The last example I want to give is the center that I run at the University of Arizona. Essentially, how do you sort and sift among all of the issues that people are dealing with and really focus on the important themes, the strategic ideas, and so forth. So in the center that I run, basically all we're doing is harvesting knowledge from across the entire university, trying to get people to work together to network internally so that they can have more impact externally. And we've picked 4 major strategic initiatives. One is bridging the gap between science and decision making, which after this talk, I'm hoping you're not too surprised to hear. It's one of the things that I want to work on. Managing risk in a complex, interdisciplinary, and multi-sectoral context. Obviously, all these linkages I've been talking about. Supporting transformational adaptation and preparing for extremes. And then finding synergies between adaptation and mitigation. So we cannot have strategies that simultaneously increase carbon emissions while we're building seawalls, or we can't actually increase risk by engaging in managing emissions. So just trying to link those things is quite difficult because the communities that have been engaged in these topics have actually been very different communities, and these questions have been handled separately up until now. So final thought here, how do we define success in all of these, this sort of mess of ideas? And I think it's whether we're focusing our investments on measurable improvements in human and environmental welfare, and how will we know that we are making those improvements unless we set up a system that manages, the information. How do we know where we are now? How do we measure whether we're making progress? And how do we integrate this idea of assessment of the state of knowledge with adaptation on an ongoing basis so that it's not a one-off effort, but a sustained effort to make better decisions? So basically, final thought here. Obviously, it's easy to get distracted by politics and issues of financing and everything else. But if we keep our eyes on the ball, we won't be run over by the train. Anyway, thank you very much, and I would be very happy to answer questions unless they're really hard, in which case I will duck and run. But I appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Kathy. We've got a couple of microphones doing the rounds for people to ask questions. So if anyone like to, do I have any, who would like to ask a question?
Thank you. You mentioned the limitations on the co-production of knowledge. Could you share a little bit more about what you see as the limitations of that approach?
Sure. I mean, as a concept, it's a great idea. There's no doubt about it. The problem is there are so many transaction costs. So, there's the establishing initial relationships and the sort of trust between the parties who may be coming from very different perspectives. And then there's overcoming all the language problems and all of that. I mean, I think it has been shown to be the most successful way to solve problems is for people to be sort of defining the problem together and then working on the solution together. That is clearly a best practices solution. The problem is, how are you going to do that with, California has 5,000 utilities. How are you going to do that with all the different communities that you're dealing with here? There has to be something scalable about it, and yet fundamentally, it's very hard to scale. So that's really what I mean.
Thank you. Right here. Amid that movement into action, oftentimes with this semblance of urgency, you mentioned maladaptation. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, some of the dangers of maladaptive practices?
Absolutely. So one example that is really commonly given is the idea of building a seawall in order to protect a community. That seawall might very well change circulation patterns and cause more erosion in the adjacent community. It might be inadequately designed, so it actually traps water inland and floods people on the uphill side. There are so many linkages between physical systems and social systems that you could have unintended consequences for poor people who happen to be affected by that construction process, all those kinds of things. So it's really thinking at multiple scales, both physically and time frame wise, about the linkages between what you're doing and the broader objective before making a decision, I think, is the best way to avoid those.
We have a question on our Slido. I'll just ask that. Is it this one here? What would you say to climate deniers who say it doesn't matter what we do in New Zealand due to how small we are compared to the US, China, India, etc.?
So it doesn't matter because of the emissions of those countries? Is that what you're saying?
I guess that's what the
Sure.
question is asking.
So if you are a climate denier, it is hard to argue about whether or not extreme events are occurring. I guess in many cases you can argue about who caused it. But the actual observations are pretty clear, and those can be used to make arguments with climate deniers. That being said, if you don't believe that it's a human-caused problem, then you probably don't believe that we're on a trajectory that leads to a much more frightening future. And that is actually a problem. If people don't understand that where we are today is caused by humans, they're going to assume that this is natural variability, and we're going to come back to some kind of, normal, when in fact that would be a very misleading thing. I have talked to many climate deniers in the past, and I think there's a whole range of ways to respond. If what you're really trying to get them to do is listen to you, you sort of need to listen to them and understand why are they deniers, what is their background, where are they coming from. And if that doesn't work, I have a friend who always suggests that you say, well, I know how I know what I know. How do you know what you know?
I'm sort of picking up on that last point a little bit more, and the last slide you had was this point of measuring success. How do we go about measuring and defining success when we're talking about changing a future we don't even know about?
Absolutely.
What's the success will be measured against the counterfactuals. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. I think what I really mean by that is that there needs to be it's really consistent with this idea of ongoing assessment of the state of knowledge. And so if your original objective turns out to be not achievable because everything around you is changing and your assumptions were wrong, then if you're in an assessment process, so that you can evaluate that and understand it and try a different approach, then at least you're not stuck in a failure cycle. You're actually getting out of that and moving into the next phase. But your point's incredibly well taken. I mean, with so many things changing, whether it's land use or demographics or economics or climate change and biodiversity and hydrologic systems, if all of those things are changing simultaneously and they're linked, you could easily just throw up your hands and say, I'm out of here. But I do think that if you are in an iterative process where you can correct your directions, you're looking at a future with multiple scenarios so that you can adjust your expectations, you are much more empowered than if you thought you were going to go to one future and the bridge got broken and you can't get there.
Thanks, Kathy, for an excellent talk, really touching a number of buttons that are absolutely immediate to us. I've got a question that I really am wondering about, and that is about the ways that major organisations and businesses make decisions for future investments. There is a pattern of assumption whereby there's a certain time frame for a return on investment, an assumption that the world will stay the same for a long period of time, and a kind of inbuilt assumption that once you construct something, it's there for quite a long time and nothing will happen. And so there's a number of ways that businesses and major organisations like councils build their thinking around investment that are completely being destabilised by climate change, and yet those decision-making patterns are not changing at this point. Have you any advice about how to change those?
Well, I don't think you can sort of unilaterally change decision processes. That being said, I think that there are things happening out there, some in the legal arena and some in the economic arena, that are going to incentivize different behavior. A good example is the fact that Moody's, which now does an assessment of the bond rating of all the cities in the United States, and I don't know who does it here or if anyone does, but they have announced that they are going to actually downgrade the bond rating of cities who don't have sustainability plans and resilience officers and so forth. So what that does is it provides an incentive to think about things a different way than cities have historically from an economics perspective. There's also an indication, which may or may not become a revolution, which is that there will be more and more legal liability associated with failure to adapt when you know what the threats are. It's sort of similar to what's happened with cigarettes and what's now starting to happen anyway with climate change and emissions. We may pass a threshold where those arguments are so compelling for the business sector and so forth that it's part of their just normal process. We are not there yet.
So we'll have an opportunity for about another 3 questions. So James.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you very much for your presentation. You talk about the need for an understanding of risk to be, I guess, focused at the level where it can be responded to, and that those risk receptors, those people affected by risks, all have or those ecosystems or whatever they might be, all have different timeframes and the complexities with that. How have you, at the national level, risk assessment managed to interface with state level or local level risk assessments, and I'm just interested in that interaction.
Well, the answer is we really don't do that. We have in very specific areas, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has specific rules for how they engage with local jurisdictions relative to floodplain management and so forth. And there are disaster management requirements that if you want federal funding, the state has to have a disaster management plan in place. And so there are ways that the federal government can incentivize behaviors in local jurisdictions. That being said, I would say we don't have the kind of unified strategy that could cause those kinds of behaviors more broadly, really incentivize engagement in doing the right thing, or at least having processes in place that support doing the right thing, because honestly, knowing exactly what that is in advance isn't that easy. But if you have good processes in place, that's very helpful.
Kia ora, Kathy. Thanks for. We all know that the trend of climate change is clear, but there's a lot of uncertainty in those details. And you were talking as well about not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm just sort of wondering whether you have any ideas about how do you know when you've got enough information and also strategies for communicating uncertainty between the scientists and the decision makers, and then strategies for how to make decisions within that uncertainty environment?
Wow, that's not an easy question. So I think part of it has to do with risk tolerance. If what you're doing doesn't have life and death consequences, or it's not a really long-term decision that's being made, then it's actually more reasonable to make assumptions about future climate conditions. If you, however, you're building infrastructure that's going to last for an incredibly long time and has life and death consequences, obviously a higher degree of certainty might be required. And so working with the stakeholders to understand, what is the risk tolerance of this particular decision process can help you design the strategy to fit the purpose of that conversation. She acts like I answered the question. Okay.
There we go. One last question down the front.
Kia ora, Kathy, tēnā koe. So I'm interested to hear how the voices of traditional practices of Indigenous communities have been provided for. I feverishly glanced at your presentation and noted there was only kind of one bullet point that related to that. Given that, here in Aotearoa we kind of operate in a more partnered way.
Yep.
So I'd be really interested to hear your comments on how that's been factored into the kaupapa.
Sure. So I can certainly talk about my own efforts. For example, the largest project that we have started within my center is something called the Native Nations Climate Adaptation Program, which is focused explicitly on helping tribes. And if you don't know, we have 567 federally recognized tribes in the United States, plus a very large number of unrecognized tribes, all of which have more than the average amount of risk and really important things at stake. And so that's sort of an example. Within the National Climate Assessment, we actually built a capacity program for the tribal engagement in our assessment, and that which had never been done before. We actually put staff on that concept and had them working with tribal members to have peer-reviewed literature come from that effort so that we could cite it, because there was inadequate amount of peer-reviewed literature. And so that was the only topic that we did anything like that with. In other words, we were explicitly trying to build capacity to have meaningful conclusions in the assessment related to tribal engagement. So those are just two examples, but can talk more later.
Thank you, Kathy.
Okay, thank you.
I think we'll move on from there. But certainly, Kathy, your overview around managing risks, I think, has been extremely helpful for setting our template for today. I think there are some valuable lessons that we can learn from you, and again, thank you for your presentation.